Bo Derek became world famous off a single scene. She ran down a beach in a swimsuit. For about a year after that, an enormous chunk of the planet decided she was the most beautiful woman alive. She had never trained as an actress, and she had no real idea what was coming. That's not the interesting part, though. The interesting part is what the world did to her next. The same culture that crowned her spent the following decade turning her into a national punchline. She let it happen. And she walked away from the whole thing without a trace of bitterness. She has been called one of the worst actresses in Hollywood history, to her face, in print, over and over. She also seems to be one of the most contented people the business ever produced. Both of those things are true, and the space between them is the whole story. She was born Mary Kathleen Collins in Long Beach, California in 1956. She was the oldest of 4 kids. Her father worked for the company that made Hobie Cat sailboats, and her mother did hair and makeup. Her mother's most famous client was the actress Anne Margaret. That detail matters because it's the thread that pulled a beach kid toward show business. When her parents divorced, her mother went to cosmetology school and then worked styling Anne Margaret full-time. Mary Kathleen was not a focused student. She once skipped a solid month of school to surf and lie in the sun. When her mother found out, she was furious, and the girl went back to class for a while. She didn't last long. Years later, David Letterman teased her on live television because she couldn't even remember the name of her own high school. By then it hardly mattered because the thing that pulled her out for good wasn't surfing. Her home life had already shifted under her. After the divorce, her mother married a Hollywood stunt performer, so the business was always somewhere in the background of her childhood. She grew up near the edges of fame without ever being aimed at it, which is part of why she was so unready when it finally arrived. She hadn't set out to act at all. The idea came from a talent agent she met through her mother's connection to Anne Margaret. She was a pretty teenager from the beach who got told she should try movies. That is how she ended up in that audition room in the first place. There's something worth holding on to in that picture. Before she was a symbol or a punchline or anyone's creation, she was just a Southern California kid who liked the ocean. Everything that happened to her happened on top of that ordinary starting point. She was 16 when she auditioned for a low-budget romance and met the man who would run the next 2 decades of her life. His name was John Derek. He was a 46-year-old director, he was married, and he was about to take over everything. John Derek had been a handsome leading man back in the 1950s, but his own stardom had faded by the time they met. He was better known by then for the beautiful women he married and remade than for anything he did on screen. He had a habit of finding a young, gorgeous unknown and turning her into a project, and people had started calling him a Svengali for it. So this was not a man who stumbled into her by accident. He cast Mary Kathleen, decided her blonde hair was wrong for the part, and had her dye it dark. Then the production traveled to Greece to shoot, and on that shoot, the married 46-year-old began an affair with the 16-year-old he had just hired. This is the part of her story that usually gets softened or skipped over. It shouldn't be, because it shaped everything that came after. Because of her age, the relationship was a serious crime in California. So John took her to Europe and kept her there. By several accounts, the move was specifically meant to keep her out of reach of age of consent laws until she turned 18. There was a real threat behind it. Her own agent reportedly wanted John charged for being with a minor. The couple's answer was simply to stay overseas even longer. So she spent her late teens abroad, living as a much older man's partner. She dropped out of school for good and learned to live like an adult years too early. She has described it gently as a teenager in love, but by any measure it was not a normal adolescence. The adults around her saw a situation they couldn't stop. Her agent tried and failed. Eventually everyone simply gave up trying, and she was left to grow up inside it. While they were over there, the film itself collapsed. The money ran out during editing, and a lab in Munich seized the reels over an unpaid bill and locked them away. That movie sat in a vault 4 years before surfacing in 1981, retitled, long after she had become famous. They came home once she had turned 18. They married in 1976 when she was 19 and he was 49. She took his last name and a brand new first name, and Bo Derek existed for the first time. She also married into a strange situation. John had 2 grown children from an earlier marriage, and both of them were older than his new wife. The household had its own history of damage, and now a teenager sat at the center of it. For a while after the wedding, her career was nothing at all. The Greek film was still locked up in Germany. She landed exactly one small part in a 1977 horror movie about a killer whale, where her character loses a leg. Then came 1979 and the role that detonated her life. The director, Blake Edwards, was casting a comedy called 10 about a panicking middle-aged man chasing his idea of a perfect woman. He picked her over a long list of other young actresses. The film built toward a scene of her on a beach with her hair braided into cornrows. That look attached itself to her name and never came off. It got copied and parodied for years, long after anyone remembered the plot, and for a stretch of months, she was simply everywhere. The reaction was enormous and a little unhinged. The culture started treating her as the literal standard that other women would be measured against. That is a bizarre thing to do to any real person, and it landed on her almost overnight. Think about what that title actually meant. The movie's whole premise was a man rating women on a scale, and she was the 10. For years afterward, her name was used as a unit of measurement, a thing men said about other women, and she was a human being underneath it. She picked up a Golden Globe nomination for New Female Star of the Year. She posed for Playboy in 1980 and again over the next few years. Often the photographer was her own husband, which only deepened the sense that he was building and selling a product called Bo Derek. Here is what made it genuinely strange. She had no resume to speak of. Most stars arrive after years of small parts, commercials, and television, so the public meets them slowly. But she came out of nowhere. She has admitted she was completely unprepared for it. She had never once dreamed of being famous or sitting at a giant press conference. Today's actors get coached and managed for those moments, she pointed out later, and she walked in with nothing. One minute she had been an unknown married to a fading director. The next, she was the face on magazine covers and the name on everyone's tongue. There was no gradual climb to steady her, just a sudden drop into being the most discussed woman in the country. She later put it bluntly. The press, she said, basically created her. Reporters who had never heard of Mary Kathleen Collins dug into the old files on John Derek and built a story out of his reputation instead. So the easiest possible narrative took hold. He was a Svengali, and she was his creation. The label stuck before she had said much of anything in public, and it would follow her for decades. The strange thing is how little say she had in any of it. She wasn't building a persona or chasing a brand. The image got assembled around her by reporters, by the studio, and by the man she was married to, and she was mostly just living inside the result. It also turned her into a target. A lot of women, including many feminists, did not enjoy watching a man's idea of a perfect 10 get crowned as a national event. She was barely 21, and suddenly at the center of an argument she had never asked to start. She didn't help her own case by the standards of the moment. She was married to a much older man who openly controlled her image. To a lot of people, she looked less like a star and more like proof of everything that was wrong with how Hollywood treated young women. And the timing of all this was cruel. The fame was white hot, but it was also brief. The window where she could have done almost anything she wanted lasted maybe a year, and what she did inside that window would decide the rest. After 10, the studios came running. She could have signed with any of them and let experienced people build her into a lasting movie star. She didn't do that. Instead, she and John started their own production company, and they named it Svengali Inc. The press had spent 2 years mocking him as the man pulling her strings, and rather than fight it, they printed the insult on their own letterhead. The logic, by her own account, was John's. He told her to produce her own films so that she alone would own whatever happened next. He had watched other overnight sensations fade and then spend years blaming everyone around them. He wanted her to have no one left to blame but herself. It almost sounds generous when she explains it that way. It also meant that John Derek, who was not a good filmmaker, would now direct the most important movies of her career. That single decision is the hinge the whole thing turns on. It went about as badly as you would guess. There was one hopeful detour first, a real drama with Shirley MacLaine and Anthony Hopkins and a proper studio behind it. But the films that defined her were the ones John insisted on making himself. In 1981 came their version of Tarzan, told from Jane's point of view and built almost entirely around her body. It was rated R, heavy on nudity, and the estate of the author who created Tarzan was horrified enough to sue to stop its release. A federal court eventually made them trim a few minutes of footage and let it open. There was more behind that fight than offended fans. Warner Brothers was developing its own serious Tarzan film at the same time, and the underlying rights were a legal mess. The Derricks had walked their cheap version straight into the middle of a studio turf war. It's worth knowing she was not a passenger on any of this. As the producer on Tarzan, she reportedly fired 15 of the 23 crew members on a brutal location shoot. Whatever was happening to her career, she was helping to run it herself. And here's a twist that kept the whole pattern alive. Despite the reviews, Tarzan was a hit. It cleared $35 million and landed among the top films of its year. Audiences showed up in droves. Critics did not. Roger Ebert was nearly the only major reviewer who defended it, while the rest tore it to pieces. Then came the award nobody wants. She won the Golden Raspberry for Worst Actress, the prize that exists purely to humiliate people. So the man who had made her a sensation was now making the films that turned her into a joke. And she kept showing up to star in them. The next was Bolero in 1984, made through a studio famous for cheap and sensational pictures. By the accounts of people who worked on it, the shoot was miserable from start to finish. The film was so saturated with sex that it fought the ratings board, and the reviews were brutal. It swept the Razzies and handed her a second Worst Actress. What's striking is that none of it slowed her down. The bad reviews and the open mockery just seemed to roll off her. They went back one more time in 1989 with a comedy called Ghosts Can't Do It. It earned her a third Worst Actress award. That film also carries a piece of trivia people still repeat. The Worst Supporting Actor prize that year went to a man playing himself in a small role. That man was Donald Trump. By the time the Razzies marked their 20th year, they nominated her for Worst Actress of the entire century. She'd been reduced to shorthand for a beautiful woman who couldn't act. That was her public identity, fair or not, and had been built almost entirely out of films her own husband directed, which is where the real puzzle of her sits. The man she loved had built her up and then personally directed every film that tore her down. You would expect at least some bitterness, and there is none to find. Not in public, not in private, in any account she has ever given. She called John her soulmate and her partner in every sense. Her explanation was that you stay with someone only as long as you both want to, never out of duty, and they had no children binding them together. So in her telling, every single year they stayed married was a year they both actively chose. They were together for more than 20 years. She once joked that it was either true love or John was the most incredible Svengali who ever lived. It would be easy to write her off as someone who was simply controlled, but she has had decades since his death to revise the story, and she hasn't. The loyalty seems to be genuinely hers, which is harder to explain and more interesting than the simple version. The marriage ended the only way it could. In May of 1998, John had a heart attack and went through 2 surgeries that didn't work. He was 71, and with her consent, he was taken off life support. The man who had made nearly every decision of her adult life was suddenly gone, and she was only 41. She has said the loss completely flattened her. For about 5 years, she didn't date anyone, not out of a vow, but because the spark simply wasn't there. Think about what she was facing. For her entire adult life, one man had steered everything with her or for her. Now she had to figure out who she was on her own, widowed, in her 40s, and famous mostly for movies people laughed at. What she leaned on was the things she had loved before any of it started. She had grown up riding, and in her grief, she went back to the horses. The animals didn't care that she'd won 3 Razzies, and there was something in that she could use. And then her life did something almost nobody predicted. It got quiet, and it got good. The thing that anchored her was horses. She had ridden since she was a small child, and she turned that lifelong love into a real cause. She wrote a book in 2002 about everything horses had taught her, and she campaigned hard to end horse slaughter in the United States. The governor of California appointed her to the state horse racing board, and she served on it through multiple reappointments. The causes kept widening from there. She spent the better part of a decade working with disabled military veterans, traveling to events and sharing programs for them. The Special Forces community eventually named her an honorary Green Beret. This wasn't a quick photo op for her. She showed up year after year at events built around helping wounded veterans compete in sports. It was the kind of slow, repeat commitment that never makes headlines. Most people who remember the beach scene have no idea she did it. She took on wildlife next. She became an ambassador against the illegal wildlife trade and was named a special envoy on the issue by the State Department. A sitting president appointed her to the board of trustees of the Kennedy Center. It is a strange resume for the woman once crowned the perfect 10. There are no acting awards anywhere on it. There's just steady, unglamorous work that nobody required her to do. The title of her book tells you something about how she sees her own life. She framed it around the idea that everything that really matters, she learned from horses. It's a quiet way of saying the most important parts of her were never the parts the cameras cared about. She got harder to label in other ways too. She calls herself a political independent and means it literally, having supported a Republican president and also voted for Barack Obama. She flatly refuses to be pinned to one side of anything. She never chased a comeback either. There was no big return to acting, no attempt to rewrite the verdict on her career. She seemed content to let the movies be what they were and to put her energy somewhere else entirely. Her romantic life came back to her slowly. In 2002, she started seeing the actor John Corbett, known from a hit wedding comedy and a long-running television show. He is a few years younger than she is. They were together almost 2 full decades before quietly marrying in December of 2020. Her first marriage had begun in scandal when she was 16. Her second arrived in middle age with no drama at all. They settled onto a California ranch surrounded by her horses and a pack of big dogs. It is about as far from the press conferences of 1979 as a person can get. Which brings us back to the question the press asked about her from the very start. Was she a real person making her own choices, or a woman someone else invented? She has spent decades fielding some version of that. Her answers are honest in a way that's rare. She says flatly that she has no regrets. She also says there are things in her past that make her cringe to think about, and she doesn't pretend the two ideas fit together neatly. She's been careful about telling her story at all. For most of her life, she avoided interviews about the hard parts. When asked directly about how things began with John, she has never tried to defend it. What she has said is that she feels terrible about it. That sits very uneasily next to calling him the love of her life. And somehow she holds both at the same time. So here's what you're left with. For about a year, she was the most looked at woman on earth. The films that should have made her a real actress were directed by the one man who loved her and couldn't direct his way out of trouble. The woman the world once reduced to a single number turned out to be a great deal harder to add up than that. She never blamed him, never left him, and never got the career that beach scenes seemed to promise her. Instead, she built a completely different life out of horses, veterans, and animals, far from the cameras that once chased her.